Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait another minute for more people to join us. So if you can't hear us, that's just because our panelists are currently muted, but we'll begin in just a minute. Welcome, everyone, to Jane Austen and Company. My name is Anne Verdig, and I am a doctoral candidate in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as the co-director of Jane Austen and Company. Jane Austen and Company is a free public humanities series hosted by the Jane Austen Summer Program. Our first series, which took place at Durham Public Library in the 2019 to 2020 season, focused on historical female writers writing at the same time as Jane Austen. Our new series, which will take place online throughout 2020, focuses on staying home with Jane Austen, examining the domestic arts and social relationships found in Austen's novels. We are so thrilled to have all of you here tonight. We had over 500 people register for this event, which is our largest registration to date. And we're also excited because we're welcoming Jennie Batchelor for our third speaker in the Staying Home with Jane Austen series. Tonight, Jennie is talking about crafting with Jane Austen and her new book, Jane Austen Embroidery. Before we begin, however, we have a few things to say, and I'm going to hand things over now to my co-host, Dr. Inger Brody. Inger, you're muted.
I'm Inger Brody. I'm a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I'm a founder and a co-founder and co-director of the Jane Austen Summer Program with my colleague, James Thompson, and co-directing this series with Anne Verdig. We're delighted to have you. We were very sad to postpone our usual annual 4-day Jane Austen Summer Program this year because of COVID-19, because we felt that it was at its heart a community building in-person event. So we came up with this new series, and we've discovered the many benefits of the Zoom medium. It's enabled us to bring in these top-notch speakers from around the world whom we otherwise wouldn't have been able to bring to our JASP program. Now, to introduce our speaker, joining us from Surrey, she says, not very far from Box Hill, is Jennie Batchelor, professor at the School of English at the University of Kent. Jennie works and publishes in the long 18th century, focusing primarily on women's writing, authorship and anonymity, periodicals and women's magazines, representations of gender, work, sexuality and the body, book history, material culture studies, and the 18th century charity movement. In April of 2016, Jennie presented a few episodes of the New Statesman's Hidden Histories podcast series, The Great Forgetting, Women Writers Before Jane Austen. And in 2017, she was invited to speak at the Cheltenham Literary Festival about the enduring popularity of Jane Austen. You may also recently have heard her speaking at the Chawton House Literary Lockdown event. We're pleased to have Jennie here, not only because of her longstanding interest in the history of fashion and material culture, but also because we see her as a kindred spirit in the dedication to public engagement in her research. She curated the amazing Great Ladies Magazine Stitch Off, Great Ladies Magazine Stitch Off, a project for which the people around the world recreated 11 rare surviving embroidery patterns from the Ladies Magazine for display at an exhibition to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the publication of Emma. Jennie is also a patron of the Kent branch of the Jane Austen Society. But most will know her as the co-author with Alison Larkin of Jane Austen Embroidery, Authentic Patterns Reimagined for Modern Stitchers. And this is a Dover Publications book. It was just reissued in a US paperback edition with the new cover earlier just a few weeks ago, just in 2020. So the structure of tonight's presentation will be about a 35-minute presentation from Jennie with lovely images. And we'll go straight from there to Q&A. So we should have plenty of time for Q&A from the audience. And we plan to conclude somewhere between 1:20 to 1:30. Sorry, about Eastern Standard Time. I know many of you are from around the world.
We also would like now to introduce Emily Sfera, who some of you might recognize as our technical director for Jane Austen and Company. She is moderating the audience chat tonight. She is also the registrar of the Jane Austen Summer Program and a graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill. Emily is going to talk about how to use the Q&A system for tonight.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We are thrilled to have you all here with us. You might have noticed that your cameras and your microphones are automatically shut off tonight. That's because we have such a large audience with us, and for bandwidth purposes, it's a little bit easier on our end if you participate primarily through chat and the Q&A box. So I see that many of you have already found the chat box and you're saying hello and telling us where you're from, which is absolutely fantastic. Thank you. But when it comes to asking questions for Jennie, either throughout her presentation or at the very end during the Q&A session, please go ahead and use the Q&A box, which is also on the bottom of your screens or your Zoom window, should be to the right of the chat button. And so that will help us determine which questions are content questions for Jennie and which questions are perhaps technical difficulties or some other kind of backroom questions for me or Anne or anyone else on the Jane Austen and Company team. So yes, use the Q&A box. We will try to get to as many questions as possible during the Q&A sessions, but every other kind of questions that aren't about content, throw them in the chat and I will keep an eye on that throughout Jennie's presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. After the chat and the Q&A, please do stick around. We're going to be announcing the next 3 programs in our Staying Home with Jane Austen series, as well as, very exciting, the winners of our creative contest. Who won that signed copy of Hilary Davidson's book? Just please do note that tonight's program will be recorded. So if you drop out, if you have technical issues, don't worry, you will be able to watch it later on our website. We will notify everyone via Facebook and our website when that's available. And without any further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Jennie.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen, and because some of my images are a little large, it may take a minute or so to do that. So while I'm doing it, I will just say if it's unseasonably warm in Surrey, and I'm in a very tiny room, so I've got the window open and it's rush hour here. So if you get too much traffic noise, perhaps Emily, Inga, or Anne, if you say something in the chat, they can let me know, and I'll shut my window. I may look a little flushed as a consequence, but I would like you to be able to hear me. So thank you so much for coming. I was delighted reading all your comments in the chat earlier about all the wonderful places that you are. It's terrific to be in your virtual company. And my particular thanks to Emily, to Anne, and to Inga, not just for inviting me to talk with you today, but also for putting this fantastic program together. I've very much enjoyed the previous talks by Casey and by Hilary. And I think, very much as Inga was saying, one of the lovely things to have emerged from this not very lovely situation that we find ourselves in is the way that individuals are coming together to sustain the communities that the current global pandemic is threatening. And this is certainly one of the lovely things, this program, to have emerged from this particular situation. So as you know, my topic today is crafting with Jane Austen, which feels like a particularly apposite topic at the moment, when of course so many of us are turning to craft and artistic activities to occupy our days, to attend to our well-being, to make gifts and bring joy to other people, to join a wider creative community. And for me, I think especially to experience the consolations that making can bring at a time when it feels like things are falling apart, right? And the slides I'm showing you now, I should say, are just 3, yes, that is a mask on the right in case you were wondering, just 3 of the many things that people have been making in recent weeks using 18th century embroidery patterns and project designs from the book that Inga's spoken about, that I worked on with professional embroiderer Alison Larkin, entitled Jane Austen Embroidery, which came out earlier this year. So this is the UK cover that you're seeing now, which is a frame that was stitched by Alison using motifs from several of the patterns in the book. The US edition, I'm just going to hold up there. It looks rather, it has a different cover, both delightful but different. I'll say a little bit more about the book at the end for those who may be interested in it, but I'll just say for now that it's a crossover history come how to craft book about women and decorative needlework, particularly embroidery, in the Georgian period. And it looks at that through 2 principal lenses. So the first is Jane Austen's life and her novels, and in fact novels by lots of other people too. And the second lens is a popular, hugely popular actually, an influential women's magazine that Jane Austen read and that issued hundreds of embroidery patterns over a period of 50 years, entitled The Ladies' Magazine, or Entertaining Companion for the Fair Sex, which ran from 1770 to 1832, but published patterns only for the first 50 of those years. I'm a little obsessed about the magazine. I'm just in the process of literally finishing up another book, which I've been working on for a very long time about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but not as much as I'm used to. So I'll try not to let my enthusiasm get the better of me. Now, today's topic is huge, right? It's a huge topic. So this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I've tried to narrow down the focus, but I'm very happy for it to open up as you wish in discussion afterwards. So we're going to be heading out on a journey to think about how craft, and as I say, specifically embroidery, figured in the life of Jane Austen and some of her contemporaries. And I'm going to be talking about how necessary I feel it is to challenge some long-held assumptions that we've had about women's creative work in this field of embroidery. So on the way, I'm going to be bringing into the mix several examples from Jane Austen's novels. I will be making that brief detour that I mentioned into the Ladies' Magazine because I can't help myself. And also talking about a bunch of patterns, as Inga mentioned, that I acquired in late 2015, more than a decade and a half, I have to say, after I started trying to find them. And it was that discovery which led to the publication of this book. Totally unexpected. It's been a ride, let me tell you. But first I want to offer, I just wanted to begin by thinking a little bit about the title of this talk, which is delightful, Crafting with Jane Austen, delightful title. But it is somewhat problematic, I think, and problematic in ways that might be helpful to contextualize some of the things I'm going to be talking about. So handicrafts, and if we're thinking about handicrafts in Austen, we're thinking primarily, I suppose, about useful and decorative needle crafts, but also other craft activities like filigree work, paperwork, or screen painting, feature across the novels, across Austen's novels. And we can find all manner of craft activities peppering her correspondence. If you look at the index entry to the 4th, so that's the 2011 edition of Jane Austen's correspondence that Deirdre LeFay edited, you'll find 25 sub-entries for handicrafts, and some of which have multiple references in the letters. So that's a fairly high hit rate, really, especially given the relative paucity of Jane Austen letters, given the volume that she would have written. So there's a lot of talk about crafts in the letters. And of course, not only that, but we're very lucky to have some surviving examples of objects that we know Jane Austen and her sister Cassandra, and indeed her mother, made, and some that she very likely made, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on. But I think it's worth pausing for a moment just before we deep dive into this topic of crafting with Jane Austen to think a little bit about, okay, so what was the status of craft activity in this particular period? And if we think about the word craft, just to start off with, I think the question of, well, what was craft in the 18th century? In linguistic terms, I guess the answer might be not what you might expect. So, of course, we use the term craft today, don't we, to refer to a variety of creative practices by which we refashion materials into new objects. And we use the term also, of course, to describe skilled workmanship, and often forms of workmanship that sometimes aren't obviously associated with handicraft. So we might talk about an author's craft, for instance. And as an aside, I will say that another piece I'm working on at the moment is an essay where I want to argue, I think, that Jane Austen is an exquisite literary craftswoman. She's often been described as an artist, a literary artist, and in fact, her novels have been compared to artworks right from the moment of their very publication, but it's a comparison that hasn't always served her well. I think craft might serve her better, and I'm very interested in exploring that, but my thoughts are a little tentative at this point. Anyway, in Jane Austen's lifetime, authorship was not often thought of as a craft, actually. But more to the point, the word was rarely explicitly associated with the kinds of activities that I'm going to be talking about today, which were instead referred to by a variety of craft-specific nouns. So you find references in the literature of the period to filigree work, to netting or knitting or fancy work, or that generic catch-all work, the most commonly used word to describe craft activities, particularly plain or ornamental needlework in the 18th century and Regency periods. The word craft, if you actually go searching for it in 18th century literature, is much more commonly actually associated with the world of politics, actually, as in, say, statecraft, and with, how can I put this, the vices that one might associate with a particular kind of politics, I guess. So then, like now, craft means cunning, it means artifice. Okay, and of course there are plenty of crafty characters in that vein in Austen's novels, you know, your Willoughbys, your Wickhams, your Frank Churchills. I watched Emma last night, the new Emma, and that did nothing to reclaim Frank Churchill for me. I still despise the man. And of course there are characters like Lucy Steele. The women can be crafty too, and Lucy Steele is wonderfully crafty in two senses. You know, she's pretty adept at her filigree work, and she's darned crafty in other ways too, isn't she? Anyway, the most common usage, though, of the term craft throughout the 18th century and into the Regency period is that given as the first definition in Samuel Johnson's dictionary in 1755, which is manual art or trade, right? That's how he defines craft, manual art or trade. And so that's striking to me because, of course, it doesn't obviously correspond to the kinds of activities, the craft activities that we see in Austen's novels and letters, which of course are undertaken by women in the home for non-commercial reasons. I mean, even Mrs. Smith in Persuasion, you might recall, spends her days knitting pincushions, making card racks and thread cases for sale. I mean, she's financially precarious, right? But she uses this work in order to use the profits to benefit one or two poor families in the neighbourhood, not for personal gain. Okay. So why am I telling you all this? Well, this is the point I want to get around to, which is that even though many of the activities that we now think of as crafts were not always referred to as such in Austen's lifetime, the very same activities were nonetheless associated by many commentators at the time, and have since been thought of by many scholars in the same way, have been associated with some of the more negative connotations of the term. Okay, so they might not have explicitly been called crafts, but they're often associated with some of these more negative associations of the term. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that crafts like so needlework, paper cutting, tinsel printing, filigree work, or netting were often viewed as crafts pejoratively by some, in the sense that they were not art. So not art, it'd be everything else that isn't art. They were activities that many pointed out required what was seen of as manual, repetitive skills, thinking back to that word mechanical that Johnson uses in the dictionary. So manual, repetitive tasks that didn't necessarily require any kind of intellectual acumen or creative skill. They were, certainly where women were concerned, often considered amateur pursuits rather than professional endeavors. So there's a whole bunch of hierarchies, right, at play here around craft that we need to take on board, I think. There's ample evidence for this kind of disdain for women's crafts in 18th and 19th century debates about the value of female accomplishments, which included needlework, but other things too, like proficiency in other languages and being able to play the piano and drawing and dancing and so on. It was these kind of attributes that people like the Reverend James Fordyce, who wrote the 1765 conduct book, Sermons to Young Women, presented as quintessentially feminine attributes, and also, of course, essential weaponry, if you like, in the arsenal of any young woman who wanted to bag herself a decent husband. You know, that's why Mrs. Elton stops playing the piano once she's got Mr. Elton. She doesn't need it anymore. It's served its purpose. That accomplishment's done its work, right? But there was a rising swell of protest against these so-called accomplishments as the century progressed. And they're very often, particularly in late 18th century novels, understood as a kind of shorthand for female vanity and the defects of women's education. So take, for example, I just love this satire, so I'm just going to leave it there hanging while I talk about this novel. Take, for example, the 1802 novel, The Infidel Father, in which there's a character called Miss Muggleton, who's introduced to us as readers through a series of exhibits that she's made at her fashionable boarding school. And like the objects she crafts, Miss Muggleton, she's all show and absolutely no substance, right? After 7 years, 7 years at this school, all she's got to show for herself is a worked map of England, so a kind of map sampler, an embroidered fire screen, so far so good, half an Italian song that she's managed to learn, just half, mind you, half. She's painted one side of a Tiffany petticoat, and she's nearly finished a filigree tea caddy. Okay, we know all we need to know from this description, right? Now, Jane Austen was not always complimentary about Jane West, who was the author of this novel, The Infidel Father. She writes about her in her letters. But there are moments in Jane Austen's novels where we can find similar kinds of sentiments, I think, to those we see in The Infidel Father. I mean, it doesn't take much imagination, really, to think, what would Mr. Darcy think about Miss Muggleton? He, of course, is famously critical, isn't he, of the accomplished woman who is capable of netting a purse or covering a screen, but can't really do much else of note. Darcy, you might remember, says he requires something more substantial in a woman, a mind cultivated by extensive reading. And of course, there are many other occasions in Jane Austen's novels where women's accomplishments seem to be criticised. Emma Woodhouse is deeply unimpressed by the endless exhibitions of Jane Fairfax's work bags. And in Mansfield Park, Julia Bertram is shown to be capable of having worked that footstool that she's been working on. But the fact that the results are too ill done for the drawing room is hardly an endorsement of her efforts. So what you've seen in all of those examples I've just cited is that all manner of female accomplishments are targeted by critics in this period, but needlework tends to run through all of them. And I could give you many more examples along the same lines from the literature of the period. I cite many more actually in Jane Austen Embroidery too. I think that the ubiquity, the centrality of needlework to 18th and 19th century novels that are embroiled in these debates about, you know, are female accomplishments really all that valuable or not? It's frankly unsurprising, right? And it's unsurprising because, of course, well, needlework is the common denominator of women's experience in this period, right, across classes, although the kinds of needlework they do varies. When it comes to the kind of decorative or ornamental needlework that I'm talking about here today, let me be clear that I'm almost exclusively thinking about needlework undertaken by middling and upper class women. Labouring women did not in the main have the luxuries of time or access to the required materials to engage in the sort of frivolity of non-useful needlework. And the reason I'm showing you this slide, some of you may recognize it, some of you may not. It's a slide from a fabulous movie that did come out before the lockdown, so some of you may have seen it. It's Celine Sciamma's Portrait of a Lady on Fire, French movie set in 1770. The figure in the middle, Marianne, is a painter. The figure on the left, Eloise, is the sitter for the portrait that Marianne is commissioned to paint, and on the right is Sophie, who is actually the servant, but throughout the movie is engaged in ornamental needlework. And as you can probably tell just by this image alone, this is a very unconventional setup. This is a this is a film that draws attention to the radicalness of the community that these women create, if just for a short time. In this film, people like Sophie really don't, in the main, engage in the kind of work that I'm going to be talking about today, but they do for a moment in this film. And if you haven't seen this movie, go see it. It's absolutely fantastic. I thoroughly endorse it. Okay, so as I say, labouring women then do not in the main conduct this kind of needlework that I'm going to be talking about today, because this kind of work, the kind of work I'm going to be thinking about in relation to Austen's novels, it's a work that requires leisure, right? That's really important. It's needlework that requires leisure. Young girls were expected to learn plain and decorative needlework at home in this period from a very young age, 5 or 6. We have some examples where girls are being taught it even earlier. And some would have been able to stitch their letters and their names even before they could write them. This is Cassandra Austen's letter alphanumeric sampler. Dozens of conduct books place domestic embroidery at the heart of their models of ideal femininity. And in their prescriptive models of womanhood, practicing needlework kind of distills the virtues of self-regulation, appropriately feminine, that is sort of leisured industry, and neatness that were required of them. And of course that work itself is supposed to, the kind of samplers like this that I'm showing you right now are supposed to materialize those virtues, like in an object: neatness, simplicity, inconspicuous elegance, which is supposed to somehow be, you know, there's a way in which this is supposed to somehow correspond to the character of the maker. Okay, but many of Jane Austen's contemporaries, of course, railed against such arguments. Mary Wollstonecraft, oh, excuse me, I have her face. No, I do have her face. Mary Wollstonecraft, author of Vindication of the Rights of Woman from 1792, is probably the most famous voice of her generation to decry embroidery as something that she said contracted women's faculties. She very much presents it in that work as a way of keeping women's hands busy so that they don't exercise their minds too much. Another still more vehement critic was Mary Lamb, who in an article for the British Ladies magazine in 1815 wrote, and I quote, "Needlework and intellectual improvement are naturally in a state of warfare." If you don't know her story, the talented and ferociously intelligent Mary Lamb was forced to support her family, including Charles, her essayist brother, by becoming a dressmaker. She detested this occupation, she deeply resented it, and it exerted extraordinary pressure on her already precarious mental health. And in fact, one day, Lamb broke down, moved to attack her apprentice while at work, and accidentally killed her mother, who was trying to shield the young girl at the time. Now, for a very long time, the strong, articulate voices of the likes of Wollstonecraft and Lamb, and the kind of circumstantial evidence that I've been giving you, these sort of anti-accomplishments arguments that we find in various novels from the period, have really overshadowed how we've thought about women's needlework in this period, where many scholars for a very long time tended to agree with Wollstonecraft that needlework was a way of oppressing women. Now, there have been concerted efforts to dislodge these narratives, particularly in the wake of the publication of Rosika Parker's wonderful 1984 book, The Subversive Stitch, which, again, if you haven't read it, go read it. You will not regret it. It's stunningly illustrated and absolutely magnificent. And more recently, there's been a number of critics who have been working to try and worry away at these narratives through various case studies and through various research initiatives. I've been working in this area. I'm thinking also of people like Serena Dyer, Freya Gowley, Hilary Davidson, Chloe Wigston-Smith, Nicole Pohl, Amanda Vickery, and others. Nonetheless, despite our efforts, and we really are trying, let me tell you, those kind of entrenched narratives about needlework being an oppressive technology have persisted and remain somewhat entrenched. And that's partly, I think, because of the very vexed relationship that feminism has to needlework for very good reasons. But it's just more complicated, I think, than many have suggested. Let me be clear. There is no doubt that the views of the likes of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Lamb were more broadly representative. They didn't just speak for themselves, but they didn't speak for everyone. That's my point. They really did not speak for everyone. And many other women experience needlework very, very differently. And one of the things that in my own ongoing work that I'm really committed to doing, and the next project after I've finished the Ladies Magazine book, is to think about how we might go about capturing the range of women's experiences of needlework in and across classes in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And I feel that's really, really important because, of course, whilst there are huge rises in literacy in the 18th into the 19th century, you know, there are many women who have limited access to reading and writing. And I think academics have been very, certain kinds of academics anyway, have been very fixated upon the written word as they're kind of the key to our past. And I think opening up the material archive and looking at the rich legacies that so many women who otherwise are unavailable to us through textual archives, the kind of histories that they can make available to us is really exciting, and it's work that needs to be done. And I'm very committed to trying to make that happen along with many of my colleagues. Now, one woman who did leave more of an archival trace than most, particularly a material archive even, is, of course, Jane Austen. Now, for her, I think very much, her experience of needlework was not Mary Wollstonecraft's, not at all like it, in fact. For her, needlework was not this kind of solitary, decorous activity imagined by the likes of Fordyce in Sermons to Young Women. It was a social activity. It was communal, and indeed it was often quite raucous. There's a lot of chat, there's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of laughter, there's a lot of fun. And my favourite Jane Austen anecdote, if you heard Hilary's talk a little while ago, she said it too, but I'm going to say it again because I pretty much say it in every Austen talk I give because it's really not heard enough. My favourite Jane Austen anecdote is one that was related by one of her nieces, Marian Knight, who describes sitting with her aunt at their needle at work, by the fireside, quite quietly, contentedly, until the silence is disrupted by Austen bursting into laughter, scurrying away to a table, frantically scribbling something down, who knows what, but you know, the implication could be that it's one of her novels, before she gets whatever she wanted to get off her chest onto paper, and then goes back to the fireside and starts working quietly as before. What a fantastic anecdote for somebody who was brought up with the Jane Austen had the creaky door because she didn't want anyone to know she was writing. That anecdote was a revelation to me, let me tell you. I absolutely love it. What it encapsulates for me is this sense that for Austen, as for many other women of her generation, Mary Delaney would be one example. I talk about her quite a bit in Jane Austen Embroidery. Women like her saw the intellectual, creative work of writing and the work of embroidery as compatible, and not only compatible, but mutually enriching. That somehow engaging in needlework was a way of freeing the mind or allowing creativity to happen. That's not something you find in Wollstonecraft, but it is something that you find in Austen and many other women writers too. Now, I'm aware that the kind of version of needlework I've just presented to you might seem a little bit out of kilter with those examples from the novels that I gave you earlier and that sort of concern about female accomplishments. And it's certainly the case that a number of people in the past have suggested that things like Darcy condemning the accomplished woman or the cases of Jane Fairfax or Julia Bertram suggest that Austen might have been critical or resentful of needlework, but utterly unconvinced by those arguments. I think Jane Austen is a much craftier writer in every sense of the term than such accounts imply. She works her readers all the time. Of course, we shouldn't take Darcy at his word when he's describing the model woman any more than it's perilous to take Wickham at his word. He is pompous, he's absurdly idealistic in his views on women, as Lizzie Bennet points out pretty much immediately after he says this. And Emma Woodhouse is not a reliable commentator either, is she? I mean, her views on Jane Fairfax's work bags have nothing to do with the blessed work bags. It's because she's jealous of Jane Fairfax, who's far more accomplished than Emma could ever hope to be. And, you know, Julia Bertram might not be good at working a footstool, and that might ring alarm bells in the reader's head about what might happen to her. But let's face it, she doesn't enter into the scandal that she enters into because she can't work a footstool. It's because her parents haven't done their job in bringing her up properly. That's the real problem. So I think these arguments are not straightforwardly anti-accomplishment, as they have sometimes been presented as in the past. That said, there are plenty of bad needlewomen in Austen's novels. I'm sure you've noticed them. While we're on the subject of Mansfield Park, it would seem rather remiss not to mention good old Lady Bertram, about whom we know everything we need to know in one sentence, when we're told that she is, and I quote, a woman who spent her days in sitting nicely dressed on a sofa, doing some long piece of needlework of little use and no beauty. I mean, really, you could write no more of Lady Bertram in the book, and we would know everything we needed to know about her from that one sentence, and that's quite typical, I would say, of how Austen uses needlework as a kind of shorthand in her work. She does something quite similar with Lady Catherine de Bourgh, of course, who counsels Lizzie Bennet and Charlotte Collins to do their needlework differently. But, you know, we're sort of led to believe that Lady Catherine probably sews about as well as she could play the piano if she'd ever bothered to learn, I guess. These bad needlewomen are morally flawed, but I think the way they function in the novel is more to throw into relief the good needlewomen against whom they are contrasted. Fanny Price from Mansfield Park, Lizzie Bennet from Pride and Prejudice are very skilled, actually, at their work, and they possess much keener mind, too, than Lady Bertram, Lady Catherine ever could, even with a lifetime of lessons behind them. While we're on the subject of lessons, let's think about Austen herself and how she might have learned needlework. Now, we don't know for sure how and where she learned. She would have learned to sew at home, and needlework would have been part of her formal education. Quite how much of a part I'm yet to divine precisely, but it would have been part of her education at school in Reading. But if her education in needlework was fairly standard for the day, the results were not. She was a very talented stitcher. In the words of her biographer and nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, and I've put the quote on the slide for you, Austen was successful with everything that she attempted with her fingers. Whether she was playing spillikins, he writes, or tidily folding up her correspondence, or transcribing fair copies of her novels, or working so finely with her needle that she would almost have put a sewing machine to shame, Austen's handiwork was always superior. And we don't need to take this at face value. We have evidence that James Edward Austen Lee was right about this, at least. The quilt that Jane Austen created with her sister Cassandra and mother, which will be familiar to many of you, I'm sure, the needle case that she made for her friend Mary Lloyd, these really demonstrate, she was very competent with a needle. We can't use them to test her nephew's claim that she was excellent at the satin stitch, because obviously she doesn't have to use them for these objects. But a monogrammed handkerchief that she made for her sister Cassandra that Hilary showed you in her talk, and this gorgeous whitework muslin shawl held by Jane Austen's House Museum suggest that she was very talented. Now, it's not known for sure that Jane Austen was the maker of this beautiful, beautiful object, but family legend has it that she was. And if you'd like to know more about it, Hilary Davidson has a wonderful blog post about this on the Jane Austen's House Museum website. I suggest you go read. Jane Austen's letters evidence her keen interest in fabrics, fashions, and style, although, of course, these were interests that were constrained by limited financial means. And we find lots of references in her novels to what we might think of as Regency upcycling, as she immerses herself in the mischief of trimming hats and bonnets and caps. And of course, she made many caps and bonnets for herself too. She used her needle in the sense in the service of her sense of style. She was very flattered, she writes in a letter to Cassandra, when her friends Martha Lloyd and Mrs. Lefroy said that they wanted a pattern that the sisters had used to make some caps of their own. But she was not at all pleased with Cassandra when she gave them the pattern, presumably because then they could mimic her own garment. She didn't like that at all. Now, so that letter got me thinking, where on earth did she get that pattern from? And of course, we don't know. There are lots of ways in which patterns circulated in this period. So if you look at women's correspondence, if you look at the correspondence of people like the Blue Stockings, or Susan Holloway has done some wonderful work about Angelica Schuyler's letters, where if you look in the margins, there's often these lovely little what look like doodles. Turns out a lot of them are designs for patterns that women are circulating between themselves. So you'd see something, you'd copy it, Austen does this herself, and then other people can make patterns from them. You can also buy patterns from haberdashers, of course, but I like to think that one possible source for the pattern for that cap that Jane Austen made could have been the Ladies' Magazine, a periodical that I said earlier we know Jane Austen read. This is a little bit of the Ladies' Magazine. You can see something of its eclecticism there. You've got a Gothic novel on the right, left even. You've got a travel narrative on the right, and in between, sandwiched, you've got an embroidery pattern. That's one from my collection. Yes, so as I say, we know Jane Austen read this magazine. This image here is actually an engraving of her aunt, Mrs. Lee Perrott. It's from the April 1800 edition of the magazine. Poor old Mrs. Perrott, the engraving was commissioned to accompany the magazine's account of her trial. She was imprisoned for several months and then tried at the Taunton Assizes for stealing a card of lace from the haberdasher Elizabeth Gregory. She was acquitted within about 15 minutes, but it was a deeply traumatic event, of course, for Mrs. Lee Perrott, her husband, and the whole Austen family. The Ladies' Magazine, as I say, is a wonderfully eclectic publication. I'm not going to talk about it in detail, but just to give you a flavour, it has lots of essays in it on all sorts of educational and moral subjects. It has travel writing, that's from a serialisation of Cook's Voyages. It has memoirs, that's one of the wonderful actress Mrs. Siddons. It has poetry and news. And it also had fashion reports and short stories and serialised novels. And it's the fiction that provides the missing link in the Austen chain and shows us that she actually must have read the magazine. We think she was probably reading it in the 1780s, but she was most definitely doing so by the mid-1790s, especially by 1794, when the magazine published a short story called The Shipwreck. This is a short moral tale about a Miss Brandon, a woman possessed of, and I quote, good sense and sensibility, who is persuaded by her father out of her attachment to a Mr. Willoughby. And if that isn't enough to convince you that Austen may have been reading fiction in the Ladies' Magazine, then there's another example. There are many, but I'll give you one more example I could cite. The 1802 short story Guilt Pursued by Conscience, which features a Mr. Knightley, who marries an obscure orphan from a rural boarding school. And the drama of the narrative is around her being accosted in the woods by a vagrant. Where have we heard that before? Or rather after Jane Austen's Emma. So fiction in the magazine was really, really popular with readers. Charlotte Bronte read it too and wrote about having read it. But so was the magazine's other multimedia material. So it's engravings, it's song sheets, it's fashion reports and plates, although the plates don't come in reliably until after 1800. And also these, it's embroidery patterns. This is one from 1796. So the patterns were kind of in three types. They were for embroidered clothes, embroidered accessories, and for various embroidered objects. Now, I've been interested in the magazine, as I say, for a long time, at least since 1999, when I was working on my PhD on dress in the 18th century. And for that work, I really wanted to be able to write about these patterns, desperately wanted to write about them, and I couldn't. And the reason I couldn't was really very simple. I couldn't find any of them. I was looking at copies of the magazine up and down the country, because at that point it hadn't been digitized, and I just couldn't. I knew the patterns had been in the magazine. All of them are listed in its monthly contents pages, but there was no surviving evidence of them in the copies I was looking at. Why? Well, the answer's pretty obvious. They were designed for use and designed to be used in ways that sometimes wouldn't survive the usage. And in fact, I'll just show you, this is a single issue of the Ladies magazine. This is from 1816, so they're very thin. When you took this to your binder at the end of the year, you take a whole year's worth of issues to get something that looks like this, and the binder would rip the patterns out if they were still in them. Okay. So where they have survived, they're accidents of history. And it was an accident of it was a happy accident indeed that led me to acquire some back in late 2015. A research project I was running at the time on the Ladies magazine attracted the attention of somebody who owned, in fact, this is it, there's a 1796 edition of the Ladies magazine. I have to say, when I went to go buy it from her, I was a bit disappointed because I looked at the width and I thought, oh no, that's not a whole year, it's too thin. And then, I don't know where you're going to be able to see this, she turned it over and I saw this, I saw the stuffed paper and I was like, oh my goodness, because that could only be one thing, right? The folded paper around the cut paper meant one thing to me, and it was patterns. And sure enough, this half year has all of its patterns intact. I've been looking for the darn things for 15 years. This was quite a moment. And as Inga said, what I did with them was I put them on Twitter. And I was bowled over by the response. I had no idea what people were going to make them. And it started off with people saying, well, you know, what are these and who would have been making them? And then very quickly, like within an hour or so, people going, oh, I want to make that. How would I do that? And I thought, oh, I'll put them on a website. Go make them, see what happens. And that is kind of what happened. So within weeks, as Inga was saying, dozens and dozens of people all around the world, it was just absolutely wonderful, started to recreate these patterns. That's another one of mine. That's for a gentleman's cravat. I made that one. My daughter said my version looked like Space Invaders, but I've got better at embroidery since. This is a lovely shoe pattern from 1775. And then this culminated in an exhibition that we held at Chawton House Library as part of the 2016 Emirate 200 exhibition. I wish I could show you all of the exhibits from the exhibition because they are amazing, and I have multiple photographs of all of them, but these are just a few. I mean, isn't this gorgeous? This is absolutely stunning. The one on the right is by Charlotte Bailey. She's a Royal School of Needlework graduate. She was one of the embroiderers of Kate Middleton's wedding train. She did a wonderful sample board of patterns. This pair of, these shoes by Nicole Rudolph, which are on wooden hand-turned soles that she made in Colonial Williamsburg, using that 1775 pattern I showed you a moment ago with that hand-stamped buckle. I mean, this was, I was bowled over, right? And then here are two of my favourite exhibits. On the left, we've got two textile artists, Caroline Hack on the left. Normally her work is inspired by Moby Dick, but I sort of pulled her back into the earlier period to work on this. This is a waistcoat pattern which she's put over, machine stitched over a digital map of Jane Austen's Hampshire. And then this wonderful textile flower piece done by Corinne Young using a muff pattern. Okay, so after the exhibition ended, I was really sad about the whole thing because it had been so lovely. But I was contacted by Alison Larkin, who was the first person to sign up for the Stitch Off and who made this wonderful winter shawl design based on this pattern of mine from 1796. In fact, she made it in situ at the Captain Cook Memorial Museum in Whitby in full 1780s clothing when she did it. It was absolutely delightful. She asked me to give a talk about this to the Embroiderers Guild, and to cut a long story short, in questions afterwards, I had this very slide up, and a very experienced woman in the audience looked at me and said, I couldn't make that. And I was just like, what? Like, why? Like, even I'd made some stuff for the Stitch Off. I said, why could you not do this? She's very skilled. And she said, and the reason was very simple. So something I haven't already told you yet was that the patterns in the magazine never had accompanying textual instructions. Okay, there's no step-by-step. There's no information on stitches, on colours, on scale, on anything. Because the magazine just knew that women like Jane Austen would have known what to do with this, and they would have been able to make them without instruction. But the audience member clearly felt that that wasn't going to work for her. In fact, what she said was that looking at a pattern like this was like looking at a finished photograph in a recipe book, but without having the ingredients list and the method. And that just the cogs started turning, and I was like, oh, Alison, and they were like, we should do a book. And anyway, we did do a book, and the book is Jane Austen Embroidery. And I'll just finish with just a few thoughts about the book in case you would like to know any more about it. So the book Jane Austen Embroidery, as I say, it's a crossover history craft book. It has an introduction by me about embroidery in Jane Austen's Britain, in which I have many more examples than I've given you today in today's talk about how embroidery worked, how it factored into women's lives, and the range of experiences women had of needlework. And then we have 15 projects based on some of those original patterns and others that we've acquired since. I now have a collection of about 60 of them that I own myself. When they're like buses, you find one 15 years and then you find 6 and then you got 60. It's incredible. Anyway, so what we tried to do in the book was to pick patterns that we could tell interesting Austen stories about, whether they're about what the patterns were originally designed for, or what we've imagined them as. Because although the methods that Alison uses in the book to make the objects are historically faithful, we've tried to modernize the projects to engage new audiences. So for instance, that shoe pattern that I showed you earlier that Nicole made into those wonderful shoes, well, if you want, you can turn that into an iPhone case. We can show you how to do that, or Alison can show you how to do that. And we have other projects that we have a hussif, which has been turned into a modern kind of personal organizer. But of course, once you've got the book and the patterns in front of you, you can do whatever you like with them. You can turn them into a COVID mask, as we saw at the beginning, should you wish to. So I suppose what I just want to say in conclusion really is that what we tried to do in the book really was to capture in the illustrations, in the projects, and in the essays, and the combination of the essays and the projects. We wanted to capture the pleasures, these mutually enforcing pleasures, as I say, of stitching, of reading and writing, that I think very clearly for Jane Austen were mutually sustaining and were for many other women too. And I think we're discovering now in this COVID world that we live in are newly sustaining for new makers and new communities and new individuals in ways that we had not imagined when this book first came out. So that's, as I say, very much a whistle-stop tour of these issues, but I just wanted to throw lots of things at you, see what stuck and see what you'd like to talk about. Thank you for your time.
Excuse me. Thank you, Jenny. We have quite a few questions popping up in the chat, so I will pass it to Anne and to Inger to bring those questions to you.
All right. Well, I can start with one we have here. You mentioned this briefly, Jenny, but can you say a little bit more about how the Ladies Magazine was published, whether and how Jane Austen would have received it?
Yeah, so in terms of, so it's a monthly magazine, and like monthly magazines today, that means weirdly there's 13 issues a year. So there's 12 monthly issues, and then there's a 13th supplement issue at the end of the year. Okay, it was published in London. Its publisher for the majority of its run was a hugely important publisher in the period, George Robinson and his family. So he's the largest wholesale publisher really in 18th century Britain, working out of London, but very well networked. So the magazine was read all over the country. Robinson had very good connections with booksellers in America and in Scotland and Europe. So the magazine traveled. George Washington actually took, there's an inventory where we can see he took copies of the magazine back for his stepdaughter Patsy, actually at Mount Vernon, which is extraordinary. But there are lots of, it traveled, it really traveled. So it came out to London. In terms of how you would get it, so you can access the magazine in lots of different ways. It's very cheap, right? So it's 6p an issue, which relative to the price of a novel is very cheap. Relative to the price of other periodicals, it's quite cheap. Magazines are much cheaper than essay periodicals, say, like the Tatler and Spectator and their later equivalents and so forth. So you can either just be a subscriber and get it through directly through Robinson on his shop, or through your local bookseller. Alternatively, the magazine was available through libraries. So one would hazard that if Jane Austen most likely read it in that form, that she would have acquired it through a circulating library. It was very, we know she used libraries, of course, all over the place as she moved around. And so it's very likely that she read it there. It's also the case that the Ladies' Magazine was heavily excerpted in other publications, including the Hampshire Chronicle, right, which we know the Austen family accessed. So there are multiple possibilities for how she would have, how she could have accessed it if she did. But yeah, there's all manner of possibilities. Thank you.
Can you talk about what tools they would have had in sewing kits? Are they very similar to the same tools we'd use today, or is there anything different or unique about what they used back then?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things are very familiar. So, and if you want to get really into the real detail of this, Alison has a lovely section at the beginning of the book where she talks about materials and methods. So talks about some of this stuff. So again, everything around needlework is very socially and class specific in this period. So the kinds of objects that you might have had, the kind of etuis or needle cases, and the quality of your needles, and and so forth, I mean, there was an extraordinary disparity. I mean, there's some of the supposedly utilitarian objects that the very upper class women use to do their needlework are like art objects in and of themselves. But yeah, fundamentally, the range of equipment is fairly similar. A lot of the patterns in the Ladies' Magazine are for a particular kind of embroidery called tambour. So they say patterns for the needlework or tambour. And so, so tambour's a bit different. Those needlework enthusiasts amongst the audience today will probably know what it is, but if you don't, it's a form of needlework which you do with what looks a bit like a crochet hook, and you sort of go down and up like that. It produces a really beautiful, well, it would if I didn't do it. I'm much better doing chain stitch by hand, but if you get really good at it, it produces this beautiful uniform chain stitch, which is, if you look at a lot of sort of domestic embroidery from this period, it's used an awful lot. But yeah, I mean, often, I mean, they did do embroidery using a hoop. Sometimes they had it on a kind of drum, or they used it on a slate, or had it sort of, you know, on sort of pegged out almost like a canvas. So some of the methods were a bit different. The method of getting the patterns onto fabric, again, are not that dissimilar. So they would use 18th century equivalents of light boxes. I've seen some really terrifying pictures of women using candles with big frocks on, you know, right underneath their work, so they could transfer patterns. You just think, oh my goodness, that's not a health and safety. That's not a good thing from a health and safety point of view. And pricking and pouncing, which is still sometimes people use today. So they had a thing which was a bit like a pizza cutter. So you would go over the outlines of the pattern, it would produce holes, and you'd have like a chalk and, you know, do the outlines. So essentially the equipment is fairly similar. There are some things which are very period specific. Alison does her embroidery on sort of big frames, big slate frames. I'm a hoop person, like that terrifies me. That was much more common, but generally speaking, it's fairly, it's not that unfamiliar. And in fact, the stitches are also not very different. It's a lot of satin stitch, a lot of long and short stitch, a lot of chain stitch, stem stitch. It would be quite familiar to needleworkers in this audience.
You mentioned that there were no instructions attached to these patterns. What about color choices? Were those up to the needlewoman?
Yeah, so yeah, they were. I mean, very, very occasionally you will get, so the obvious example is mourning, right? So when there are times of national mourning, which the magazine really heavily leads in and participates in, so the death of Queen Charlotte and so forth, the magazine goes into a period of mourning, and the embroidery patterns change to reflect that. So obviously they're made in black, right? So they do sometimes specify that, but that's very rare. Occasionally you'll see saying something like to be worked or worked in colours, which is because, of course, a lot of these patterns, so think about the muslins that a lot of these objects would have been made out of. Think of that, those beautiful shawls and aprons. They would have been white work, a lot of them. But equally, they can be, the sprig designs, for instance, could be worked in white work or could have been worked up in colours. So yes, it's up to the makers. So one of the great revelations for me, really, about the stitch off and the wonderful work that so many people did was that it really brought home to me, in ways that I sort of knew before but hadn't actually experienced, just how much creative license and creativity was required of the maker, and the extent to which, you know, one pattern in two people's hands could look quite different depending on stitch and colour choice and so forth. So I think there's a great deal of, as I say, you know, going back to this idea about it's all being very repressive and mundane and mechanical, there's actually a lot of artistry in this, I think.
Can you talk at all about the differences in class when it came to the production of needlework? Were women of working classes less likely to participate in this type of needlework? Were they going to, or a different type, or would they do it for employment?
Yeah, so I mean, there are certain kinds of needlework skills that are useful assets for most women. So plain sewing, plain work. So Jane Austen talks about doing this kind of work. So look, kind of working with your linen, making shirts for your brother, as Jane Austen describes in her letters. She said she was the neatest worker of the path when she was making Edward's shirts. Those kinds of skills were useful to everybody. Mending, I mean, Jane Austen did not have a lot of money. She needed to know how to mend clothes, right? And most women would have done, whether you were labouring class, on the fringes of gentility, middling sort. So there are certain needlework skills that are useful for everybody. Mending, plain sewing, darning, and so forth. There are certain needlework skills that it would be unusual for women above a certain class to be automatically acquainted with, or even a little bit acquainted with. Things like spinning, we associate more with labouring class women, of course, and knitting. I mean, Mrs. Smith in Persuasion, remember, she has to be taught how to knit by Nurse Rooke. She doesn't know how to knit. She knows how to sew. She doesn't know how to knit. It's not to say lots of middle class women couldn't knit, but there are certain variations there. And as I said, I think the kind of decorative, fancy work, ornamental needlework, it's of no use to labouring women unless they are so skilled in it that they undertake it professionally and go into millinery or dressmaking trades. There's a lot of discussion in 18th century novels where it's very common. So a lot of novels, kind of the drama of the novel, of course, is created by a woman who, for whom things start to go very badly wrong, and then things have to be resolved, and then she can get back to where she was at the start of the novel. Frances Burney does this a lot, a novelist whom Jane Austen really loved and admired. And one of her novels, for instance, is called The Wanderer. It's the one of her 4 novels that doesn't get mentioned in Northanger Abbey. And in The Wanderer, the heroine of that, Juliet Granville, she's very much been taught decorative needlework. The kind of needlework she needs as an accomplishment, not for trade. And part of the trauma of Juliet's social descent before things start to go the right way for her towards the end of the novel is tracked through her having to step by step, sort of, almost, it feels like prostituting her accomplishments as trade. She gets to the point where she's actually being told, because she can sew so very well, because she isn't one of those labouring women who's been taught to do this for work. She's really good at it. There's a bit where, from her point of view, there's a bit where she talks about the excruciating horror of being asked by the woman that she's forced to work with for sitting in the window of the millinery shop and having to sew in the window as a kind of advertisement for the goods that the woman is selling, who she works for. So there are all sorts of class-specific context and nuances in this. But yeah, and there's a definite kind of hierarchy of needlework too. So as I say, that Celine Sciamma movie that I showed the still from, I just want everyone to go see it because I loved it. The first thing that I thought was like, there's a servant, and why is she just doing decorative needlework? That's because this is as I say, it's a very unusual setup. It's not to say some women couldn't do it, but of course it requires access to certain materials and tools that were just not readily available unless this was what you were doing for your work, you know.
Speaking of that last point, a couple of people had questions about acquisition of materials and about which materials and threads were imported, which were made locally, where they might have bought embroidery thread and crewel yarn, whether it would be a haberdasher like Ford's or in London.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are lots and lots of haberdashers. So the kind of haberdashers who were, haberdashers done a lot of different things in the 18th century. If you look at their trade cards, they're quite extraordinary. there's one haberdasher who's based in, I'm going to blank now. I think it's Somerset. In fact, I'm sure it's Somerset. I got very excited when so one thing I've been trying to work on for a long time is trying to locate some of the pattern drawers who made the patterns in the ladies magazine, and only one to my knowledge is actually cited on the pattern. There's sometimes you find there's a lot of arguing in the newspapers when the magazine started to release the patterns in 1770, because the pattern drawers felt that their livelihoods were being threatened because the magazine was effectively undercutting them by mass producing them. So there are certain personalities, you can sort of get an inkling of who they are, but it's very hard to track them down. But there's one guy I found who's a haberdasher in Somerset. I was able to track down his trade card, and it's very clear he claims at any rate that he could certainly provide all your haberdashery needs for your sewing in terms of textiles and silks. I mean, mainly. So embroidery in this period there's a lot of silk on silk embroidery, or cotton on cotton, so white cotton on white muslin and silk on silk. So yes, I mean, haberdashers would have been the main source for acquiring this material. I'm afraid I have to just fess up, I know much less about crewel work, so I don't know if there's a particular kind of distinction there, but I suspect not, in terms of how one would go about acquiring the materials.
What about knitting? Do we know if Jane Austen knit, or did you find evidence of knitting patterns in periodicals like the Ladies Magazine?
No, I've never found, well, certainly not in the Ladies Magazine. There's no, so there, it has some other kinds of patterns. So it has very occasionally it has patterns for paper work, and of course there is evidence of paperwork in Austen's novels, and indeed in her letters too. And there are patterns for filigree, so the kind of, the way you curl the papers, kind of soft Lucy Steele does in Sense and Sensibility, but no knitting patterns that I'm aware of. And I'm afraid I'm terrible at knitting. I'm a sort of happily bad embroiderer. Well, I'm not that bad, but I'm not that good. But I'm absolutely hopeless at knitting, and therefore I've sort of not. It's going to sound awful. I'm not interested in it. I just can't do it. It's just too much coordination. Whereas embroidery feels to me like drawing. So I feel happy with it, because it's like you can sketch, and then if you do it wrong, you can sort of go over it and you can pick it. Knitting feels, it's a whole other thing. But no, there are no knitting patterns in the magazines that I'm familiar from in the period. So whereas the kind of embroidery patterns that in the Ladies Magazine are replicated in other periodicals like La Belle Assemblée, which comes along a little bit later, Ackerman's Repository of Art, which comes along in 1809, or things like the New Ladies Magazine, which is a rival to the Ladies Magazine. No, you don't have knitting patterns in there, so I'm not so sure about where they would have actually come from. But yes, I mean, there are references to knitting in, as I say, in Persuasion and in other of Austen's sort of life and works, but I just don't know where people got their patterns from for that.
Just to clarify, filigree and quill work, are they the same? Quilling, are they the same thing?
So so that's the curling of so there's that bit. Do you remember the bit in Sense and Sensibility where Eleanor manages to get out of playing a game of casino by offering to curl the papers for Lucy Steele for the filigree basket that she's making for that utterly spoilt niece of hers, Anna Maria? That's filigree work. Yes, we would call it quilling. Yeah.
Okay. And one participant asks whether you've ever managed to match an extant garment with one of the patterns from the magazine.
Twice, yes. So yeah, it's really fun. And there's another one that I think I may have tracked down, but I'm not 100% sure. So I sort of have to wait till travel is allowed and I can actually be completely sure. So the example I'm going to talk about, and I'm not going to take any credit for it at all, because I don't deserve it. So I have a wonderful colleague who is Dr. Alicia Kerfoot, who is at SUNY University Brockport. So Alicia's a fantastic 18th century scholar, and she's been working for a long time on shoes in the 18th century. And so when we released the patterns and I said, I've got the shoe pattern, like she was just like crazy excited. So that 1775 shoe pattern I showed you earlier that Nicole Rudolph made into those beautiful shoes in Williamsburg. Alicia worked those up for the stitch off, and she made 2 silk uppers using silk on silk it looked beautiful. She sent them over, we had them for the stitch off, and I asked a number of people who made things for the exhibition to write blog posts about their experiences, and Alicia did so. And as she was doing her blog post, she sort of had this nagging doubt. She goes, I've seen these shoes, I've seen them, because of course she's seen a lot of shoes. And she wrote to me very excitedly one day, and she went, I found them. And so the very pattern that she was working on was a pair of shoes that Alicia had seen in the collections of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And the V&A has on, you can still see them on the catalogue, it says that it dated the shoes to maker unknown, between 1770 and 1779. And we were able to say, actually, this is the pattern, it's from 1775. And the really spooky thing about it was that the colours and the scale and pretty much everything that Alicia had done, it's almost identical to these shoes that she had seen and somehow obviously subconsciously on some level had remembered. But one of the things I'm interested in trying to do, but this seems a bit far-fetched, but I think could be possible, is there's a lot, of course, now of image recognition technology, image matching technology. And one thing I'm really interested in trying to do is to work with some of my more adept digital humanities friends and colleagues to think about if there's a way of using the patterns and somehow trying to do some image matching with extant clothing collections to see if we can do it. There is another example. There's a portrait where we actually of a girl in America who is carrying a work bag, and the work bag actually survives, and the work bag I can trace back to a ladies' magazine pattern as well. That was a really such a coincidence. That's not a way to do research, just hoping you find things on the internet that look like the thing that's in front of you. So I need to find a more systematic way of doing this kind of matching. But yeah, I mean, people did use them. And indeed, we also have letters where, and diaries where people describe using them. So one example is Ellen Wheaton, the poor Ellen Wheaton, the very unhappy governess, who's living at the same time as Jane Austen, and who living in Lancashire, and writes these wonderful diaries that are very popular and lots of people have read. She talks about using the patterns for the ladies' magazine, which she's got stuffed in a work bag with copies of the magazine in a drawer. And again, I think it's in a time of mourning. She writes to a friend and says, can you get them out the drawer, because I need them, because I need to make something. So we know they were used. And I think the fact that they've all been, so many of them have been taken out of the magazine is some indication of their usage too.
You had this really interesting distinction between the ideas of craft and art in this time period. And one of our audience members is asking specifically about lace making, but I'd also like to ask you a little bit more broadly, like, were there textile manual work that was considered art, or were they all kind of part of this idea of craft?
Well, there are certainly many people who want to talk about craft as art. What we would think of as craft as art. So one famous example would be Mary Linwood. So Mary Linwood is this extraordinary woman who produced what she called needle paintings, so portraits in thread, and they were stunning. She wanted to claim for herself, and if you look at her work, you can see she had every right to identify as an artist, and for her art to be for her work to be taken seriously as art. But of course, you know, this is a period where women's relationship to art in general is somewhat fractious. Of course, there are a good many highly talented, hugely celebrated women artists in this period. One of the images I showed in my PowerPoint earlier was a frontispiece for the ladies' magazine, which was designed by Angelica Kaufman, you know, who's a founder member of the Royal Academy. There's two women who were there when the Royal Academy gets started. And then it's like hundreds of years, right, before there's another woman. You know, it's Angelica Kaufman, Mary Moser, and then no one, right? So women have so there are people who want to claim, and who are very eloquent in trying to claim needlework and embroidery as art, for sure. But it's very complicated, not least because there are lots of reasons, but not least because women's status as artists is quite complicated at this time, right? There are celebrated women artists. There are plenty of them in England and France, all over Europe, and in America too. But nonetheless, as I say, that the kind of the status of their work is not institutionally supported, if I can put it that way.
And that would go for like lace making and quilt making and related arts as well?
So I mean, so there are, so I mean, good Lord, lace making. I don't know if I mean, clearly some people in your audience will have done. I've tried it. It's incredibly complex work, highly, highly skilled work. So, and there are people who write instruction manuals to teach various craft practices, whether they're fiber arts or other kinds of practices, who refer to their craft as art. So for instance, Chloe Wigston Smith's been doing some wonderful work on Hannah Robertson, who writes a very, very popular sort of craft instruction manual that goes through multiple editions over many, many years. She never uses the word craft, not once in this manual, ever. I had to check with Chloe. I was like, she really doesn't, does she? Because I think I'm making this up, because everyone's talking about crafts, but she never uses the word, right? She went, no, she doesn't. But she refers to these practices as the little arts. So there are ways in which people are trying to mobilize the language of art, use the language of art to talk about craft, but often in very qualified ways, like, you know, little arts. So yeah, it's a complicated thing, not least because, as I say, women's relationship to art in this period is just very complicated.
Jenny, one of our audience members asks if you can repeat the name of the woman who did needle painting.
Yeah, Mary Linwood. Go look her up. She's amazing.
One of our audience members asked whether there are any men doing needlework. And maybe we could expand that a bit also to consider what were gentlemen's handicrafts or accomplishments.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, I've actually found lots and lots of references to men knitting. Again, it's a sort of class, there is a class sort of dynamic to this. I'm sure there are men who can sew. I mean, of course, there are men who sew professionally. And of course, one of the strange things in this period is that most of the surviving embroidery from this period was professionally produced embroidery. So stunningly embroidered waistcoats, for instance, that you might find in museum collections in the UK and the US. Almost all of the ones that you will find, there are examples of domestically made waistcoats in collections, but the vast majority will be professionally made, and very many of those professional embroiderers would have been men. Alison, in fact, who I has a real expertise in waistcoats. Alison has recreated the waistcoat that Elizabeth Cook was making for her husband, Captain James Cook, while he just in the run-up to him being killed in Hawaii. So she's made a replica of this never finished waistcoat, never finished because he died, and she is an expert on waistcoats from this period. She's done some work looking at the kind of the female-made, domestically made waistcoats and the professionally embroidered. Often it's not always easy to, or even very often to be able to identify provenance securely, of course. But you know, looking at sort of professionally made male embroidered garments against female-made, domestically crafted garments, and she writes very interestingly about the discrepancies that she finds between the two of them. So yeah, I mean, there are plenty of men who can embroider, and many male professional embroiderers. One of the most important pieces of evidence we have for 18th century embroidery, it tells us so much about what we know about how 18th century embroidery was done, is a manual by a French man called Saint-Aubin, for instance, which comes out in 1770, so when the Ladies magazine is published. And in fact, my instinct is that all of the pattern drawers for the Ladies magazine would most likely have been men. We know that one of those rival magazines that I mentioned earlier that produced patterns was called the New Ladies magazine. Its patterns were attributed, they were designed by a Frenchman called Charles Stryat. So there were many men who were very influential in embroidery in terms of designing them, in terms of professionally making them. In terms of the home, quite honestly, I mean, yes, there are men who can engage in plain sewing. You will find descriptions in diaries and letters and so forth. But I haven't found, I maybe haven't looking been looking that hard, but I haven't found many examples of men at work in the same way that you find women at work with their needle in the 18th century in quite the same way, certainly nothing like the same extent.
We have a few people who are interested in your research process, particularly your archival work. Have you found any other extant needlework patterns from that period from other sources in the ladies' magazine? And how do you date these? Somebody brought up, is it possible for these patterns to be republished and reprinted in other texts or works?
Yeah, so that's something that, it's been driving, yes, it causes me a lot of headaches. So, so where this all started was with the periodical, my periodical, as I think of it, the ladies' magazine, which I'm, as I say, completely obsessed with for a whole bunch of reasons that have nothing to do with the patterns as well as the patterns. So I started with that, and then I started looking at other periodicals that produce them. So once the ladies' magazine starts to produce the patterns, many follow in its footsteps. Some follow so closely in its footsteps that they, well, I don't know what the right verb would be, reprint, appropriate, recirculate, plagiarize, I don't know what the word is, but they redistribute the patterns that are in the ladies' magazine. So an example would be, there's a magazine called the Hibernian magazine, which is a Dublin publication. The Dublin published industry can be notoriously piratical in the 18th century, and pretty much 3 months to the day after the ladies' magazine produces a particular pattern, it finds its way into the Hibernian magazine. So they do get research. I don't know whether that was an arrangement. I've tried to find out if there was any kind of business arrangement between Robinson's magazine and Walker's Hibernian, but I have no evidence of that. There is evidence of patterns circulating in other countries. So as I said, I know the ladies' magazine was available in America, and I've got evidence of American readers of the magazine. But there are in, say, Colonial Williamsburg, you know, there are a number of patterns that you can find in the collections there, which are patterns that are in the ladies' magazine, but in the stack of patterns that they're part of in that collection, they're not dated and there's no source. So whether they came before what's in the ladies' magazine, whether it's the ladies' magazine itself that's being piratical and just reprinting stuff that's already in circulation, I haven't yet been able to find out with certainty. But again, that's part of a sort of later project that I would really like to do a little bit more work on, is about how these things circulate. But of course, the other thing, as I say, is that they're not just these patterns are not just circulating in printed form in periodicals or through patterns that you can buy individually in haberdasher shops. They are circulating in things like the doodles that you find in the margins of women's correspondence, where they go, oh, I like that cap, here's this sprig, I saw this sprig, look at this sprig, and then go, oh, I can do that sprig, you know. So they circulate in lots of different ways. But yeah, I mean, to ask me a question about my research process is really nice, but the word process accords it more structure and method than I've been able to find. It's like it's a minefield. It's a minefield.
Well, a very fertile and productive one. I think we have many more questions here, but I think we need to stop for our because of our schedule. Thank you so much for all those delightful and intriguing answers. Anne, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jenny, for joining us tonight. And thank you to everyone in the audience who participated and sent us questions. We've seen a lot of your requests for some of these texts and films that have been mentioned. We'll include those in our follow-up email tomorrow. And wherever possible, we'll try to include links so that you all can find them. Before we leave today, however, I would like to invite you to our next 3 events in the Staying Home with Jane Austen series. We have some really, really interesting topics coming up, and we would love to see you all there. On August 11th, we'll be making music. Janice Brooks is the professor of music who led the project to digitize the Austen family music books. So she's going to be talking about music in the Georgian period, as well as what we know about the type of music that Jane Austen and her family would have sung, played, and made. Then on August 25th, We have Susanna Fullerton talking about dancing. Susanna Fullerton is one of the leading literary lecturers of Australia. You might note the time is a bit later to accommodate the time difference. And she's a wonderful, charismatic speaker who's written on dancing with Jane Austen before. And then on September 3rd, we have Playing Games with Jane Austen. Joanne Staples is a former professor of mathematics at Vanderbilt University, and she's also written a book on card games in Jane Austen. So she's going to talk to us generally about what gaming was like, as well as teaching us a few games that Jane Austen herself would have played. All of these programs are free and will take place over Zoom. Just like today, they'll all be recorded in case you can't make them. And you can register for them via our website, janeaustenandco.org.
And if you'd like to read more about Jane Austen, her life, the afterlives of her works and adaptations of her works, come check out the blog for the Jane Austen Summer Program or follow us on social media. The Summer Program, or JASP as we call it, is a 4-day summer symposium that typically takes place in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in June. It features lectures, hands-on workshops, small discussion groups, a Regency ball, and a tea. We like to blend scholarship and fandom together for an informative and fun weekend. For more information, you can visit our website at janeaustensummer.org. Next year's program, as Ingrid mentioned at the beginning of tonight's presentation, will be on Jane Austen's world. So we will be exploring many of these topics that the Jane Austen and Company lectures have been exploring as well. Now, some of you who attended the last presentation might remember our creative writing contest on dressing with Jane Austen, and I'm happy to announce the winners of that contest today. So our grand prize winner, getting first place in the adult category, was Cassandra Chambers for her letter to Francis. And then the second prize, Cassandra will be receiving a signed copy of Hilary Davidson's book. The second prize winner in the adult level was Regina Rose for her excerpts from Lucy Collins' letter. And Regina will be receiving a Jane Austen and Company mug. Our high school winner was Margaret Cheney for Lydia Wickham's letter. Geez, it's truly delightful. And it was very hard to pick a few winners for this contest. They were all very delightful. So we'd like to mention the following, just honorable mentions. So Leslie Hawley, her Regency dress short story, Lynn Slowden for her letter, and Kimberly Costa for My Dearest Mariah. Thank you to everyone who participated. As I said, it truly was a delight. We are also going to be having a contest for or around Jenny's talk, so around crafting with Jane Austen. I'm still working out all the tiny details for that one, but please keep your eye on our Facebook and our website for more details about that contest in just a few days. And
I'd like to show, these are the mugs, the Jane Austen and Company mugs, which are some of the prizes. Oops, which are some of the prizes for the essay contest as well. In addition, I believe Jenny is also going to be signing a copy of her book, so that'll be one of the prizes. And Jenny also agreed to be one of our judges for this next contest, which we're delighted about. So thank you, everybody. And if you enjoyed tonight's programming, please consider making a donation to the Jane Austen Summer Program. We are a registered nonprofit, so you can, in the US, you can make your donation tax deductible. And the donations help keep these events free and open to the public. They allow us to bring in great speakers like Hilary Davidson, Jennie Batchelor, and Casey Highsmith, and our next 3 speakers as well. But they also go to supporting our other activities, such as our student essay contests and our teacher scholarships. which help middle and high school teachers attend our conference for free.
Thank you all once again for attending. We hope you remain healthy and safe, and we hope to see you for our next installment, Making Music with Jane Austen, on August 11th at noon Eastern Time. Have a great day.
And
Yes,
thank you,
so
Jenny.
much, Jenny. Bye, everyone.
Bye.